All right, so are you ready to dive deep? Today we're tackling Atomic Habits by James Clear.
Oh, yeah, this one is a classic.
I feel like everyone and their mother has recommended this book to me at some point.
It's popular for a reason. There's some really good stuff in there.
For sure. And if you're listening in, I bet you're the type of person who's not just interested in theory. You want real change. You want to actually see those results.
Right. Absolutely. And James Clear is basically arguing that you can make huge changes just from tiny little improvements, but you got to do them consistently over time.
Yeah, he even compares it to like compound interest, but for your habits.
It is pretty fascinating how Clear takes a concept that feels so simple on the surface and just backs it up with science.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like he talks about compounding, but then he goes even deeper and talks about neurology, like how habits are formed in the brain.
Okay, so more than just surface level stuff then, I guess.
For sure. He specifically talks about the basal ganglia and
Right.
how it basically automates behaviors for us.
Okay, so now my brain is like, okay, cool, but how do I actually USE this?
Well, that's where the 4 laws of behavior change come in.
Ah, I knew you were going to say that. I've heard of these, but remind me what they are again.
Okay, so it's not enough to just know that small changes matter. You need a framework to actually make those changes stick.
Makes sense.
And that's what these laws do. It's like a framework. He breaks it down into 4 parts. And they're super simple but powerful. Make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying.
Okay, I can see how those would be helpful, but is it more complicated than that, or is it just common sense?
It is a bit deeper than just common sense.
Oh.
Like take the first law, make it obvious. This actually uses something called the cue routine reward loop. That's at the heart of how habits work. So by making the cue obvious, you're basically priming your brain to start the routine.
Interesting. So it's less about forcing myself to do things and more about understanding my own brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, it's not just for building good habits.
Mm.
You can use these laws to break bad habits, too. Like you can make a bad habit invisible, make it unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying. You basically flip the laws.
Okay, that's interesting. But you know what? Let's get real for a sec.
Yeah.
We all know life gets messy, right? Like, how am I supposed to remember all this when I'm stressed and busy?
That's where things get super interesting. Because Clear doesn't just give you theory. He actually provides tools.
Okay, now you've got my attention. What kind of tools?
So one example is something called habit stacking.
Ooh, I like the sound of that. What is it?
It's basically where you attach a new habit to an existing one that you already do. Like let's say you want to start flossing more.
God, I should do that.
Right. We all should. So you could try stacking that onto your existing habit of brushing your teeth. Every time you brush, you floss.
Makes sense.
That way you're more likely to remember.
Kind of like building a chain reaction almost. Like good habit leads to good habit. I actually did something similar to that with meditation. I always struggle to find the time. But then I was like, okay, what if I just do it for like 2 minutes right after I make my coffee in the morning?
So that's a perfect example of the 2-minute rule.
Oh, is that another one of his things?
Oh yeah, that's right out of the book. By starting small, you're tricking your brain. You make it think it's super easy, so you're more likely to actually do it. But the crazy thing is that often just that tiny start is enough to keep you going.
That's so true. Like it's almost like cheating.
Right. But Clear also talks about something called environment design, and that's a big one.
I've heard of that. I think I remember reading about how like just rearranging your workspace can make a difference.
Totally. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Right.
So by just making small changes to your environment, you can make it easier to do the good habits and harder to do the bad ones.
Okay, that's making more sense.
Like, think about it. If you're trying to eat healthier, but you have a big bowl of candy sitting on your counter, temptation, right?
Yeah, big
Yeah.
time.
But what if you replace that candy bowl with a bowl of fruit instead?
Okay, so I'm basically setting myself up for success. It's not just all on me to like magically have more willpower.
Exactly. But there's one more piece to this puzzle that we haven't talked about yet.
Ooh, there's more. I'm intrigued. What is it?
It's this idea about identity. Clear actually argues that focusing on who you want to be rather than just what you want to do can have a huge impact.
Okay, whoa, hold on. What does he mean by be versus do? I'm not sure I follow that.
So it's about shifting your mindset from just focusing on outcomes to actually embodying the qualities of the person you want to become. Like instead of trying to lose weight, you might focus on becoming a healthy person.
So it's like how wearing certain clothes can make you feel more confident. Like your identity is almost like a costume.
That's a great way to put it.
So if I'm focusing on being a healthy person, it'll be easier to stick to those healthy habits because they're not just items on my to-do list. They're reflections of who I am. That's really powerful, but how do you actually make that shift? Like, it sounds a little abstract.
That's where the rubber meets the road. Clear gives some specific strategies for aligning your habits with the identity you want. Like he talks a lot about how celebrating small wins can reinforce that new identity you're working towards.
So it's like I'm giving myself positive feedback and proving to myself that I am that person.
Exactly.
Okay, but I have to be honest. Doesn't all this sound like a lot of effort? I mean, it's one thing to understand all these concepts, but actually putting them into practice every single day.
You're right. It does take effort, and consistency is key. But Clear emphasizes that even small changes, if you do them consistently, will lead to remarkable results. And it takes time. He actually compares it to compound interest, but he also introduces this concept called the plateau of latent potential.
Plateau of latent potential. Now, this sounds really interesting.
Right. It's basically this idea that a lot of the time, our progress actually lags behind the effort we're putting in,
Oh, yeah, that's so true.
especially at the beginning when we're first building a habit. So we might not see results right away.
It can be super discouraging.
Right. But it doesn't mean that we're not making progress.
Oh, I like that.
Clear actually uses this analogy of bamboo. You know how bamboo spends years developing its root system before it suddenly shoots up?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great visual.
So it's all happening underground, you just can't see it yet.
So it's like trusting the process and knowing that even if I'm not seeing results yet, those small efforts are building something big behind the scenes.
Exactly. And when you hit that tipping point, when you finally break through, the results can be huge EE.
Okay, you've officially got me hooked. Now I'm excited.
But it's important to remember that everyone's journey is going to be different. What works for me might not work for you.
Yeah, that's fair. We're all different.
The important thing is to experiment, find what works for you, and be patient.
I love that. It's all about giving ourselves the power to control our habits and make the changes we want to see. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the practical stuff for a minute. I want to learn more about how we can actually build good systems that support our habits. What are some of the specific strategies that Clear recommends?
Well, one of the big ones he talks about is habit tracking.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of those.
It sounds super simple, right? Like just checking boxes.
Yeah.
But there's actually a lot of psychology behind why it works.
Really? I've tried using them before, but I could never really stick with it.
Yeah, a lot of people struggle with that, but it can be super powerful.
Okay, I'm listening.
So for one, it makes your progress visual.
Okay.
Like you can actually see those streaks building up, and that can be really motivating.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It gives you a sense of accomplishment and reinforces your commitment.
It's like a visual reminder of how far you've come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there's more to it than that, too.
Oh.
Habit tracking can also make you more aware of your own behavior patterns.
Hmm.
So by tracking consistently, you start to notice these trends.
Like good trends and bad trends.
Exactly. And you can start to identify the things that are tripping you up.
So it's not just about celebrating the wins, it's also about figuring out what I need to work on.
Yeah. It's like gathering data on yourself.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like let's say you're trying to go to bed earlier, but you keep messing up on the weekends.
That's so me.
Well, that data tells you something, right? Maybe you need a different approach for weekends.
Yeah, like maybe I need a better routine to wind down.
Exactly. Or maybe you just need a reminder on your phone.
That's so smart. I never thought of it like that.
It's like you're turning your habits into a science experiment.
I love that. Okay, but it's not just about individual habits, right?
Right.
Didn't Clear Eye also talk about systems?
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Habit tracking actually feeds directly into building those systems.
Okay, remind me again, what's the difference between a goal and a system?
So a goal is like a specific outcome you're trying to reach, like running a marathon or writing a book.
Okay.
But a system is all the habits and processes that help you get there.
So like if my goal is to write a book,
Right.
my system would include like writing every morning, setting deadlines, maybe joining a writing group,
Exactly. You're getting...
and habit tracking would be part of that system.
Yes. Because it keeps you consistent, helps you see what's working and what's not.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense now.
It's like you're building a framework for success.
Instead of just hoping I'll magically have enough willpower.
Right. Willpower is great, but it doesn't always work.
So true.
You need a good system in place to support you.
But even with the best system, I still procrastinate sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Procrastination gets us all.
Any advice for those days when I just can't seem to get started?
Well, remember the 2-minute rule we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
That could be super helpful for just getting over that initial hump.
Okay, any other tips?
Clear also talks about something called temptation bundling.
Temptation bundling.
Mm.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
So basically, you take something you need to do, but don't really want to.
Like exercise.
The perfect example.
Yeah.
And then you pair it with something you really enjoy.
Okay.
So like, let's say you love listening to podcasts,
Ooh, yeah.
but you're not so good at exercising regularly.
Story of my life.
So you tell yourself, I can only listen to this podcast while I'm working out.
Ah, so I'm making exercise more appealing because I'm associating it with something I love.
Exactly. But sometimes we have these bigger goals,
Yeah.
the ones that take months or even years to achieve.
It can feel overwhelming.
It can. And it's easy to lose motivation along the way.
Totally. So how do we stay on track?
Well, this is where that plateau of latent potential comes in again.
Okay, remind me how that works again.
It's basically the idea that you might not see results right away, even if you're putting in the work.
Yeah, because it feels like you're just spinning your wheels.
Exactly. But it doesn't mean you're not making progress.
Okay, but how can you be so sure?
Think of it like planting a seed, right? You don't see the sprout right away.
But you know it's growing underground.
Exactly. It just needs time.
So it's like our habits. They need time to develop.
Yep. Clear encourages us to embrace the process, celebrate the small wins, and trust that those results will come eventually.
Okay, you've officially convinced me. I'm feeling much more patient now.
Good, because patience is key.
But I do have one last question.
Sure.
You've mentioned like a million different strategies and techniques.
That's a lot, I know.
It's hard to imagine trying to do all of them at once.
Yeah, you don't have to.
So where do we even start?
That's a great question. And Clear actually emphasizes that you don't need to do everything at once.
Okay, good, because I was feeling a little overwhelmed.
It's about finding what works for you and gradually incorporating those strategies into your life.
So it's like finding my own personal recipe for success.
Exactly. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
I love that.
There will be setbacks along the way. That's just part of it.
So true.
The key is to learn from those setbacks, adjust your approach, and keep moving forward.
Okay, so much good stuff. I feel like I have a way better grasp on atomic habits now,
Me too.
and I'm so ready to start putting all of this into action.
Awesome.
But before we wrap up, there's one more concept I want to touch on.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Claire talks about this idea of focusing on the process rather than the outcome.
Ah, yes, that's a really important one.
What's your take on that?
Well, it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. And it's easy to get caught up in chasing goals and achievements, right?
For sure. I'm totally guilty of that.
But Clear reminds us that real fulfillment actually comes from enjoying the journey itself.
So it's not just about reaching the finish line.
Right.
It's about enjoying the run.
Exactly. It's about finding joy in the practice, the small wins, the daily grind.
That's beautiful. And I think it's so important to remember that
Especially these days.
when everything is so fast-paced.
It's easy to get caught up in the hustle and forget to appreciate what we're doing right now.
Yeah, we lose sight of the present moment.
And I think that's why Atomic Habits is such a valuable book.
Totally agree.
It's not just about achieving success. It's about living a life that's meaningful.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot today,
We have.
but this is just the beginning.
Yeah, just scratching the surface.
There's so much more in this book, but before we jump into the last part of this deep dive, I want to take a minute to reflect.
Sounds good.
What are some of the things that have really stood out to you so far? I think for me, the biggest thing has been this shift from thinking about like big, huge goals to focusing on systems instead.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
It's like realizing that those small changes can add up to something huge-y.
It's easy to get caught up in wanting to be successful overnight. But Atomic Habits reminds us that change happens slowly. It's like those tiny actions building up over time.
Yeah, it's almost like it makes those big goals less intimidating.
Totally.
And for me personally, I think the thing that's really blown my mind is this whole idea of identity-based habits.
That's a powerful one for sure.
It's not just about like checking things off a list. It's about actually becoming the type of person who does those things naturally.
Yeah, it's like your habits become part of who you are.
It's like aligning your habits with what you really value.
Exactly. So it's less about forcing yourself and more about just becoming that person.
And that makes it so much easier to stick with those habits. It feels less like work and more like self-discovery.
It's like you're designing a life that you actually want to live.
Oh, and speaking of design, I'm super curious about this whole environment design thing.
Oh yeah, that's one of my favorites.
It's crazy how even little changes to my surroundings can have such a big impact on my behavior.
It's all about tapping into that subconscious part of our brains.
Like sometimes I don't even realize it's happening.
Right. We think we're making these choices, but a lot of it is just our environment influencing us.
So we can use that to our advantage.
Exactly. By shaping those cues, we can make it more likely that we'll make the right choices.
I love that. It's like I'm playing chess with my own brain.
That is a great analogy.
Like I'm setting things up to make sure I make the right moves.
So true.
Well, I think we've officially covered all the main points of atomic
I
habits.
think so.
But this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
There's so much more to explore.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one last thought-provoking question.
Ooh, I love these.
If you could choose just one tiny habit to start today, something so small it almost feels insignificant, what would it be?
That's a good one.
And how do you think that one tiny habit could ripple outward and create positive change in other areas of your life?
So think about the areas where you want to improve, the qualities you want to develop, or maybe even the impact you want to have on the world. Then try to break those things down into the smallest possible steps.
Because even the tiniest actions, if you do them over and over again, can build up to incredible results. That's the whole point of atomic habits.
Exactly. It's all about those small changes.
So take that first step. It doesn't matter how small it seems. Be patient with yourself, trust the process, and I promise you can create a life that is truly amazing.
Well said. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into atomic habits. And remember, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.